Alright, it's been about 6 months since I did the first video on this channel where I talked about whether or not Germany's coalition government, the Traffic Light Coalition, will remain in power and win its re-election in 2025. And I want to do a similar video now looking at the polls and the approval rating in the wintertime going into the year 2024 and see kind of what has changed, what has remained the same, and the overall trend of the parties in German federal politics as they are right now. Now, to put it mildly, things are looking much worse than they already were in the June with these polls, and it has gotten significantly worse for each of the parties involved, the SPD, Greens, and FDP that make up the current coalition. We see the CDU and AFD, the two right-wing parties, are clearly solidified in their positions in first and second, and the government parties are down in third, fourth, and fifth. Now, if we take a look at each of the individual polling numbers, we can see that the positions of each party has pretty much remained the same, but the overall number has changed. And so basically the trends that had been started in June against the SPD and in favor of parties like the AFD have just continued and have remained constant over the past several months. Now, if we look at the actual numbers of the polls in terms of the increase and decrease, we can see that the SPD is now built up an 11-point decrease. This is up from the only 6-point decrease they had. So they were polling at 19% in June. They are now at 14.5 in the aggregate, falling below 15%. Now, this is an underperformance of both their 2021 and 2017 electoral results, but this is also the worst electoral result they would get in the modern Federal Republic of Germany's history. And the number for the Greens at the same time has not increased. Despite a huge drop in support for the center-left SPD, none of these voters seem to be really going to the Greens, who are also suffering minor losses. Now, these losses for the Greens would not be a big deal. However, the SPD and FDP are suffering huge losses that it builds up basically an 18-point swing against the current government. That is more than enough to remove them from power. They are nowhere in striking distance of reaching a coalition majority. And we see the FDP has dropped. They were at around 6.5%. They are now barely above the 5% threshold, which means that if they reach only 4.9, 4.8% of the vote, they will lose all representation in the Bundestag and they will have basically no seats. And that will be a huge defeat for the party. And there's actually discussions right now within the FDP about whether or not they want to remain in the current coalition. The members of the party are voting on that. The party leader, Christian Lindner, has said he is somewhat confident of it, but there have been other party leaders on the state and federal level that have criticized their involvement. So it's not certain yet which way it will go. I think it's likely that they will stay in the coalition, but it is a game here to play because if they leave, of course, it could likely cause new elections in which they could suffer a huge defeat. But if they stay in, it risks the situation getting significantly worse for all of the parties involved. So we'll have that result in believe a week now, and then we will see what happens. But nonetheless, a significant development for each of the parties. The left party has clearly fallen below 5%. Sarah Wagenknecht from the more left wing of this party, she created her own political alliance. It's not yet been formed into an official political party, but it is very likely that it will get around at least 5% of the vote, maybe 10% federally, stronger in some of the eastern states. And with that, Die Linke is pretty much dead. They, as a political party, have lost representation in much of the west of the country and are on the brink of losing political representation in much of their eastern strongholds. The faction in the German Bundestag has dissolved itself. They are no longer at the threshold to have enough seats to form a faction. That means they have lost a lot of their staffers, a lot of their funding, a lot of their money, and their presence on the German political scene is clearly waning, but it's somewhat likely that Wagenknecht's new group will effectively replace them as the force on the left. Now, if we look over on the front, we can see that the CDU has solidified its first place position, but it is not at 27% that it was in June. It is at 31%. The AFD has also risen from around 19.5% to about 21, 22%. And this means that since June, both of the right wing parties have increased by 3 points. That's a 6-point swing to the right what was already one of the most right wing leaning polls or polling aggregates in German history. And so Germany is now on track to not only elect a parliament with a majority right wing seats, it's about to elect, potentially if there's a new election, a parliament where over 50% of the voters vote for explicitly right wing parties because the CDU is center right, the AFD is more definitely more to the right of the CDU, but a party like the FDP is more in the middle. So these two right-wing parties have never held a majority. The CDU held a majority, an absolute majority by itself in 1957, but since then there's never been a strong, simply right-wing majority without one of the left-wing or liberal parties needed for a coalition. But the AfD rising has definitely been a significant topic in German politics. It is a very controversial party, and still, as of now, most of the parties, in fact, all of the parties, have ruled out working with them. The CDU mentioned working with them on the local level if they have to, but there was some backlash, and it appears that none of the parties are willing to even cooperate or even talk to the AfD. But nonetheless, them rising to the second largest party and remaining there for several months has been a significant development, and there's even been talks about banning the party. A member of the CDU, Marco Ravanderitz from Saxony, actually submitted a proposal to ban the party. It is a discussion that's happening, but that is seen still as too radical by even some of the most hardened opponents of the AfD. Now, if we look at the numbers altogether, I mean, this is clearly a bad sign for the current government. This is a trend against what we saw in the 2021 election. The 2021 electorate elected the one of the most liberal, center-left, progressive parliaments in German history. And within 2 years, they are now on track to elect one of the most conservative, right-wing populist parliaments ever in the Federal Republic's history since 1949. So, I mean, these numbers aren't great. I mean, they are suffering significant losses. The 14.5% for the SPD, I mean, this is a disastrous result. They are the party of Germany's current chancellor. They are one of the two major parties, and they're on the brink of falling to fourth place. Now, this happened in the polls back in 2018 to around 2021. However, the SPD was able to recover because the SPD's chancellor candidate, Olaf Scholz, was more popular than the CDU and Greens chancellor candidates at the time. However, it is very unlikely the SPD will be able to do that again. And another factor is the SPD is now in the government. They're no longer in the opposition, so they are taking most of the blame for the problems that are happening in the country. And I mean, overall, these parties are reaching together only around 35%, which is not good. I mean, that's 15 points below what they need to get. To win a majority, they don't need exactly 50%, but nonetheless, this is a disastrous trend. And, what is likely to happen is still unsure. One thing that could happen is if the FDP leaves the current coalition, we could have a reshuffle, meaning that the CDU and the SPD could form a new coalition, a grand coalition with the current seats in the Bundestag, or you could see the CDU work with the Greens and FDP. However, there's some problems. The Greens and the CDU have become increasingly antagonistic towards each other. The CDU in several states has even ruled out working with the Greens altogether. So it's very unlikely that we will see that on a federal level. And even the mainstream media, which has been somewhat supportive of some of the establishment center-left parties, has been very critical of the government. And so either we're going to have a new election in a couple of months, a snap election, or we'll have one in 2025. And in that case, what's very likely is almost certain is that the CDU, with whoever their candidate is, will become chancellor, and they will either form a coalition government with the SPD or one with the FDP and Greens, or even the Greens and SPD if they have to. But not too much will change. There will still be most likely a mixed government of center-left and center-right parties. The AfD has pretty much no chance of getting into government. Even if they were to somehow reach 30% and win the election outright, it is still most likely that none of the parties will want to work with them. Now, another thing that happened recently was the Constitutional Court in Germany refused, or rather rejected, a part of the budget proposal for the current government. And what the Ampel government was trying to do was use money that was allocated for the COVID pandemic on climate change and environmental protection. And the Constitutional Court in Germany ruled that that was unconstitutional, and so basically they were short of 60 billion euros. And that was a huge defeat for the government. They are now in panic mode. And so the situation is not going to get better, and there is increasingly now protests from farmers against the current government, the Green land or the agriculture minister, and so the situation is definitely not getting good. And if we look at the overall approval rating, we see that the government's approval rating is now at 17%. This is down from what I believe the 21% they had in the summer. So the situation is not good for them. And to answer the question, will Germany's coalition government survive re-election? It's very unlikely, almost certain that they will not, and it is actually very likely that they will not even survive till their next term. But we will see. We have elections in the European Parliament in June, and then some East German state elections in September of 2024. This will be an important election year, and so this will be definitely interesting. I'll make some more videos covering those races once we start getting some more polls. But overall, I wanted to give you all an update on the current polling situation in Germany federally for each of the parties, and kind of a follow up on that video as it's been 6 months. And so I hope you all enjoyed and liked, and please, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.